The room was already loud before he entered, the kind of loud that didn't come from music or applause, but from careless confidence. Crystal glasses chimed against one another, chairs scraped polished floors, and voices overlapped in careless conversation that assumed nothing important was about to happen. It was a private industry gathering disguised as a celebration. It's the kind where powerful people congratulated one another for surviving another year at the top. The lights were warm and flattering, the walls dressed in velvet tones meant to suggest elegance, but beneath the surface, there was something sharper in the air, something brittle, as though kindness had not been invited. It was the sort of room that decided who mattered before anyone even spoke. Sammy Davis Jr. paused just inside the doorway, his hand still lightly resting on the handle as if he were giving himself one last moment to breathe before stepping forward. He had walked into rooms like this his entire life, rooms that smiled politely until they realized who he was, rooms that pretended to welcome him, while quietly measuring how much space he was allowed to occupy. Years of stages, spotlights, applause, and admiration had not erased the memory of smaller rooms where laughter had cut deeper than insults ever could. He stood straight anyway, shoulders squared, suit immaculate. Posture dignified not because he was fearless, but because he refused to let anyone see the weight he carried. At first no one noticed him. Conversations continued uninterrupted. Laughter rose and fell in casual waves, and the illusion of comfort remained intact. Then one voice faltered, followed by another, until the room shifted almost imperceptibly, like a current changing direction beneath calm water. A few heads turned, a few eyebrows lifted. Someone whispered something behind a hand that did nothing to hide the sound. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, sharp enough to be unmistakable. It wasn't joy. It was judgment dressed up as humor. Sammy felt it immediately. He had learned long ago how to recognize the difference between being unseen and being seen in the wrong way. This was the latter. The laughter didn't come from everyone, but it didn't need to. A handful of voices were enough to remind him that no matter how many records he sold, how many standing ovations he earned, there were still rooms where his presence was treated like an inconvenience rather than an honor. His jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before he relaxed it again. Took a step forward, then another, moving through the space with quiet restraint. His eyes steady, his expression neutral, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing hurt written across his face. Across the room, Dean Martin had been mid-conversation. A drink resting casually in his hand, his posture relaxed in the way only someone truly at ease with himself could manage. He was smiling, not because he was entertaining, but because he was listening, nodding at a producer who seemed far more impressed with his own voice than with the words coming out of it. Dean's smile faded the instant he heard the laughter change tone. It wasn't the laughter of celebration or shared memory. It was the laughter he had learned to recognize from years in rooms like this, the kind that tried to establish hierarchy without ever saying it out loud. Dean's eyes lifted, scanning the room until they landed on Sammy. For a brief moment, everything else disappeared. The conversations, the music humming softly in the background, the weight of the glass in his hand, all of it fell away as Dean watched Sammy walk forward alone. Dean didn't see a performer. He didn't see a guest. He saw a man who had stood beside him on stages when the lights were brightest and backstage when the lights were off. He saw someone who had made people laugh, cry, and believe in something better, even when the world insisted on reminding him of its uglier side. And he saw, with unmistakable clarity, that the room had decided to test how much respect it owed him. Dean set his glass down slowly. The producer beside him continued talking, unaware that the conversation had already ended. He simply stepped away, his movements unhurried but purposeful, as though he had all the time in the world. Chairs shifted as he passed. A few people noticed and straightened. Unsure why, the atmosphere felt suddenly different. Dean walked until he stood directly in Sammy's path, close enough that the laughter behind them could no longer pretend it wasn't being acknowledged. Dean smiled then, but it wasn't the easygoing smile he was known for on television. It was quieter, steadier, anchored in something deeper than charm. He placed a hand lightly on Sammy's shoulder, not as a gesture for the room, but as one meant for Sammy alone. Grounding and unmistakably sincere. "There you are," Dean said warmly, his voice carrying just enough to be heard without needing to rise. "I was wondering how long this place planned on pretending you weren't the most important man in the room." The words landed softly, but their impact rippled outward. Conversation stalled. Laughter died mid-breath. The producer, Dean, had walked away from stared, confused, then uncomfortable, as though realizing too late that he had missed something essential. Sammy looked at Dean, surprise flickering briefly. Across his face before settling into something else, gratitude mixed with relief. Tempered by years of learning not to expect too much, Dean turned slightly, just enough to face the room without removing his hand from Sammy's shoulder. His gaze moved calmly from face to face, not accusing, not angry, simply present. When he spoke again, his tone was still gentle, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. "You know," Dean said, "I've been in a lot of rooms like this. Fancy rooms, important rooms. I've learned something funny over the years." He paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. "The people who laugh the quickest are usually the ones most afraid of being seen." No one laughed this time. Sammy felt something loosen in his chest. A tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying since the moment he walked in. He had spent a lifetime standing tall alone, but standing beside Dean felt different. It felt like being reminded that dignity didn't have to be defended by solitude. That sometimes strength came from someone else choosing to stand with you loudly or quietly without hesitation. Dean shifted his stance, now fully facing the room, Sammy beside him rather than behind him. "If anyone here has forgotten," he continued calmly, "this man has earned every inch of space he occupies. And if that makes anyone uncomfortable, I'd suggest they ask themselves why." The silence that followed was absolute. No one argued. No one laughed. A few people looked down at their glasses. Others suddenly found the walls fascinating. The room hadn't changed physically, but something fundamental had shifted. The hierarchy the laughter had tried to establish had collapsed under the weight of one simple truth. Respect, once demanded by integrity, had a way of exposing everything else. Dean turned back to Sammy, his expression softening again. "Come on," he said quietly, his voice meant only for them now. "Let's find a better place to stand." As they walked together, the room seemed to part without resistance. Chairs were pulled back. People stepped aside, not because they were told to, but because something about the moment demanded it. Sammy felt eyes on him, not mocking now, but thoughtful, perhaps even ashamed. He didn't acknowledge them. He didn't need to. For the first time that evening, he felt fully present rather than measured. They stopped near a small table by the window, where the city lights glimmered beyond the glass like distant stars. Dean leaned against the table, relaxed once more, as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. "You okay?" Dean asked quietly. Sammy exhaled slowly, then nodded. "I've been okay my whole life," he replied, a faint smile touching his lips. "Just didn't always have someone remind the room of it." Dean chuckled softly, shaking his head. "That's their loss," he said. "Always has been." Neither of them spoke for a moment after that. They didn't need to. Outside, the city carried on, unaware of the quiet stand that had just taken place inside a velvet-lined room. But something had been set in motion, something that would not end there. Because the laughter that had greeted Sammy's arrival had exposed more than cruelty, it had revealed a test of character. And Dean Martin had answered it without raising his voice, without causing a scene, and without leaving any doubt about where he stood. And before the night was over, the room would learn that kindness, when backed by courage, could silence even the loudest contempt. The silence that followed Dean Martin's quiet stand did not fade the way awkward moments usually did. It lingered, thick and uncomfortable, stretching far beyond the polite smiles people tried to reassemble on their faces. What had happened was not loud enough to be dismissed as drama, yet not subtle enough to be ignored. It was the kind of moment that rearranged a room internally, forcing everyone inside it to confront the unspoken rules they lived by. Sammy Davis Jr. felt it as he stood near the window. The city lights flickering below like distant witnesses to something most people would never speak about openly. He had learned to recognize this kind of silence too, the silence that came when people realized they had revealed more about themselves than they intended. Across the room, conversations restarted cautiously. But the energy was different now, restrained, guarded. The laughter that returned sounded forced, as if no one trusted it anymore. Sammy noticed how eyes followed him when they thought he wasn't looking, how a few people suddenly seemed eager to smile in his direction. As though courtesy could erase what had already happened, he didn't respond to it. He had spent too many years learning that delayed kindness often came from fear rather than understanding. Still, beneath his calm exterior, something churned. Moments like these always carried consequences. Experience told him they were rarely immediate. Dean leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "They won't forget tonight," he said. Not with satisfaction, but with certainty. People like this never do. They just decide what it means later. Sammy nodded slowly. He understood exactly what Dean meant. There were two kinds of memories rooms like this produced, the kind people bragged about later, the kind they quietly reshaped to protect their pride. He had been on the wrong side of that reshaping too many times to count. Tonight felt different, though. Tonight, the discomfort wasn't his alone to carry. Before either of them could speak again, a man approached from behind with careful steps, the kind that tried to signal humility without quite committing to it. He was well-dressed, confident in posture, but not in expression, and his smile appeared only after he was sure he had their attention. "Gentlemen," the man said, his voice smooth but measured, "I hope I'm not interrupting." Dean turned slowly, his expression polite but unreadable. "Depends," he replied calmly. "On what you're about to say?" The man laughed softly, too softly, as if trying to keep the moment light. "I just wanted to say," he began, glancing briefly at Sammy before looking back to Dean, "that sometimes things get misunderstood in rooms like this. No offense was meant earlier." Sammy felt the words land like thin glass, fragile, transparent, and sharp in all the wrong ways. He had heard this language before. It was the language of correction without accountability, apology without ownership. He said nothing, allowing Dean to respond if he chose. Dean studied the man for a moment longer than necessary, long enough to make him shift his weight slightly. "You know," Dean said finally, his voice still even, "misunderstandings usually happen when people aren't listening. What happened earlier didn't sound like confusion to me." The man's smile faltered just for a second. "Well," he said quickly, "I'm sure we can all move past it." Dean nodded once. "That depends," he replied. "Moving past something doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen." The man murmured something about drinks and obligations before retreating, leaving behind an even heavier quiet. Sammy exhaled slowly, a mix of admiration and unease settling in his chest. Dean had always known how to disarm people without raising his voice. But moments like this reminded Sammy that such grace often came at a cost. Standing up for what was right rarely went unnoticed, and rarely went unpunished. As the night wore on, the gathering began to fracture into smaller clusters. Some people left early, citing schedules and early mornings that hadn't mattered when the laughter was easy. Others stayed, hovering near Dean and Sammy with cautious politeness, as though proximity might absolve them of earlier silence. Sammy watched it all with a performer's eye, noting the subtle shifts in power. The unspoken calculations happening behind smiles. Then the music stopped. It wasn't dramatic, just a quiet pause as someone adjusted the system, but it drew attention nonetheless. A few heads turned toward the small stage at the front of the room where a microphone stood unused. The pause stretched, and in that space, an idea took shape. Uninvited, but undeniable. Dean noticed it, at the same time Sammy did. Across the room, the producer whispered to another, nodding toward the stage. Another person joined the conversation, then another. The glances came quicker now, more deliberate. Something was being planned, something that felt less like celebration and more like calculation. "They're going to ask you to perform," Dean said quietly, his eyes fixed on the movement. "Not because they want to hear you, because they want to control the moment." Sammy felt his pulse quicken, though his expression remained calm. He had been asked to perform under worse circumstances, but the familiarity of the trap didn't make it any less dangerous. A performance could shift the room in his favor or reduce him once again to entertainment. A distraction from the discomfort his presence had created. Sure enough, a woman approached moments later, her smile professional and her tone practiced. "Sammy," she said warmly, "we were wondering if you'd like to do a little something for us tonight. Just something informal." The word informal hung in the air like a test. Sammy looked at the stage, then at the faces watching him with renewed interest. He saw curiosity, expectation, and something else too. Relief at the possibility of turning tension into spectacle. He considered declining. He had every right to. But then he remembered the laughter at the door, the way it had tried to define him before he even spoke. Declining would preserve his dignity, but accepting might redefine the room entirely. Before he could answer, Dean spoke. "If he performs," Dean said calmly, "it's because he wants to. Not because anyone here needs to feel better about themselves." The woman blinked, then nodded. "Of course," she said quickly. "Only if he wishes." Sammy smiled faintly, not at her, but at Dean. Then he turned back to the room. "All right," he said evenly. "One song." The shift was immediate. Chairs turned. Conversation stopped. The room leaned forward as though expecting redemption through applause. Sammy walked toward the stage with steady steps, feeling the weight of every eye, every assumption, every memory layered onto him. As he reached the microphone, he paused, letting the silence settle fully before speaking or singing. He didn't rush. When the music finally began, soft and restrained, Sammy didn't perform with flamboyance or showmanship. He sang with restraint, with control, with a quiet power that demanded attention rather than begging for it. His voice carried not just melody, but experience, the kind that came from standing tall when rooms tried to shrink you. Each note seemed to strip away pretense, leaving behind something raw and undeniable. By the time the song ended, the room was no longer the same room it had been an hour earlier. Applause erupted, but it was different now, not casual. Not polite, but urgent, almost desperate. People stood. Some clapped too hard, too fast, as though volume might make up for earlier silence. Sammy acknowledged it with a small nod, then stepped away from the microphone without a bow. Dean was already waiting for him at the edge of the stage. That, Dean said quietly as they walked away together, wasn't entertainment. That was a reminder. Sammy smiled, but his eyes were serious. "Reminders make people uncomfortable," he replied. "They don't always thank you for them." Dean chuckled softly. "They don't have to. History usually does." As they moved back toward the window, Sammy felt something settle within him. Not victory, not vindication, but clarity. Tonight had revealed something important, something that went beyond applause or confrontation. Respect, once reclaimed, changed the balance of power in ways laughter never could. And somewhere in the room, among the forced smiles and shifting alliances, consequences were already forming, because the people who had laughed first were now realizing something far more frightening than being called out. They were being remembered. The applause faded, but its echo did not. It lingered in the walls and the polished floors, in the tight smiles that followed Sammy Davis Jr. as he stepped away from the stage. Applause had a way of disguising discomfort, but only briefly. What followed was far more revealing, the subtle recalibration of power, the quiet shifting of alliances, and the unmistakable sense that something irreversible had taken place. Sammy felt it as he returned to the window beside Dean. The city lights below, now sharper, colder, like a reminder that the world beyond this room had never been gentle. With men like him, the mood of the gathering fractured almost immediately. Some guests suddenly remembered urgent obligations. Others stayed but spoke in whispers, careful not to draw attention. A few tried too hard, laughing loudly at jokes no one had finished telling, clinging to normalcy like a lifeline. Dean noticed all of it, his relaxed posture betraying nothing, though his eyes missed very little. He had spent years navigating rooms where charm was currency and silence was leverage. Tonight, the currency had shifted, and not everyone could afford the exchange. "You feel that?" Dean asked quietly, his voice low enough that only Sammy could hear. Sammy nodded. "Yeah," he replied softly. That's not relief. That's resistance. Dean's mouth curved into a knowing smile, though there was no humor in his eyes. Good instincts, he said. That song didn't just remind them who you are. It reminded them of what they can't control. Across the room, a small group had gathered near the bar, their conversation animated but contained, like a storm trying to disguise itself as a breeze. Sammy didn't need to hear the words to understand the tone. He had been the subject of those conversations before, analyzed, minimized, repackaged into something safer for other people's egos. What unsettled him wasn't the talking. It was the glances that followed, the quick looks away when his gaze met theirs, the silent acknowledgement that the laughter from earlier could not be undone. Then the first consequence arrived. A tall man in a tailored jacket approached with deliberate calm, his expression composed in a way that suggested he believed himself untouchable. He didn't address Sammy at first. His attention fixed on Dean, as though this entire evening had been a misunderstanding that could be corrected by speaking to the right person. "Dean," the man said evenly. "A word." Dean turned slowly, his demeanor polite but guarded. "We're in the middle of one," he replied. "But go on." The man lowered his voice. "You may not realize this," he said, "but moments like these have ripple effects. People remember who creates discomfort in rooms meant for celebration." Dean raised an eyebrow. "Funny," he said calmly. "I was thinking the same thing." The man stiffened slightly. "I'm serious," he pressed. "There are projects, opportunities, relationships that rely on harmony." Sammy listened quietly, his expression unreadable, though every word sharpened his awareness. He had heard versions of this warning his entire life. Consequences disguised as concern. Threats wrapped in civility. Dean glanced briefly at Sammy before returning his attention to the man. "Harmony isn't silence," he said. "And celebration that requires someone else to shrink isn't worth preserving." The man's jaw tightened. "You're choosing a side," he said flatly. Dean didn't hesitate. "I already did," he replied. The man held his gaze for a long moment and nodded once, a thin smile returning as if nothing had been said. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," he said before walking away. Sammy exhaled slowly, the weight of the exchange settling into his chest. "That wasn't a conversation," he murmured. "That was a warning." Dean shrugged lightly. "Warnings only work if you're afraid of what they threaten." Sammy studied Dean then, seeing not just confidence, but conviction, the kind that came from knowing exactly who you were and what you were willing to lose to protect it. It stirred something deep inside him, something he had carried alone for too long. As the night continued, the tension sharpened. A few people approached Sammy directly now, offering compliments that felt rehearsed, their praise careful, measured, as though trying to correct a misstep without admitting it had happened. Sammy accepted them with grace, but he did not linger. He had learned long ago that forced admiration was just another form of control. Then, just when it seemed the room had settled into uneasy coexistence, the lights dimmed slightly. A hush fell, not because anyone asked for it, but because instinct demanded attention. At the front of the room, a figure stepped onto the small stage. Not a host, not a performer, but someone with authority. The man cleared his throat, tapping the microphone gently. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "thank you for being here tonight." Dean's posture stiffened, almost imperceptibly. Sammy felt it too, the shift in tone, the deliberate pacing. This wasn't part of the program. "We've witnessed something unexpected this evening," the man continued, his eyes scanning the room before settling briefly on Sammy. Moments like these invite reflection. And sometimes, clarification. Amy's pulse quickened. Clarification was rarely neutral. The man smiled thinly. "It's important to remember," he said, "that this industry thrives on unity. On understanding our roles and respecting the spaces we occupy." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sammy felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the sense of being addressed without being spoken to, of being discussed rather than engaged. He remained still, refusing to give the moment more power than it deserved. Dean, however, stepped forward. Respectfully, Dean said, his voice carrying without effort. No one here needs clarification on unity. What we need is honesty. The man paused, surprised. This isn't a debate, he said. Dean smiled faintly. It rarely starts as one, he replied. The room froze. Every eye moved between them, the tension now unmistakable. Sammy felt the weight of decades pressing into the moment, decades of rooms, where people like him were asked to be grateful for inclusion without equality, applause without agency. Dean turned slightly, his voice steady but resolute. If unity requires silence in the face of disrespect, he said, then it's not unity. It's convenience. The man's expression hardened. You're crossing a line. Dean nodded. Lines tend to appear when someone finally stands on the right side of them. For a moment, it seemed as though the room itself was holding its breath. Then the man stepped back from the microphone. His composure fractured just enough to reveal irritation beneath. We'll continue this another time, he said curtly before exiting the stage. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was charged. Sammy felt something profound shift within him, not just relief, but recognition. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't the only one absorbing the consequences of truth. He turned to Dean, his voice low. You didn't have to do that, he said. Dean met his gaze without hesitation. Yeah, he replied. I did. The gathering slowly unraveled after that, people leaving in clusters, whispers trailing behind them. Sammy understood something with striking clarity. Tonight wasn't about a song. It wasn't about laughter or applause. It was about the moment power was challenged not with anger, but with integrity. And power never forgot being challenged. The real consequences hadn't arrived yet. They were only beginning to take shape. By the time the room began to empty, it was no longer the same place where laughter had once felt safe. Chairs were left half-turned, glasses abandoned, conversations cut short without proper goodbyes. People moved with urgency now, not because they were late, but because staying any longer meant sitting with what had been exposed. The evening had not exploded into chaos, yet it had unsettled something far more enduring. The quiet confidence of those who believed power never had to explain itself. Sammy Davis Jr. stood near the window once more, watching reflections of departing guests blur against the glass, feeling the strange calm that arrived only after something heavy had finally been lifted. Dean Martin remained beside him, relaxed on the surface, though the stillness in his posture suggested awareness rather than ease. He knew this kind of ending well. Nights like this didn't close with applause or confrontation, but with consequences that arrived days, weeks, sometimes years later. People who smiled their way out of the room tonight would speak differently elsewhere. Stories would be reshaped, motives questioned. But none of that concerned him the way it once might have. What mattered had already happened, and no revision could erase it. They're going to talk, Sammy said quietly, not looking away from the glass. Dean nodded. They always do, and they won't all be kind. Dean smiled faintly. They never are. Sammy finally turned toward him, his expression thoughtful, steady. I've spent most of my life preparing for rooms like this, he said, learning when to be loud, when to be quiet, when to smile, when to walk away. But tonight was different. Dean raised an eyebrow slightly. Different how? Sammy considered the question carefully. Tonight, he said, I didn't feel like I was defending myself. I felt like I was standing my ground. Dean's smile widened just enough to show pride. That's because you were. As they spoke, a final figure lingered near the exit. One of the earlier voices, someone who had laughed when Sammy first walked in. The man hesitated, then turned back, approaching slowly, his confidence stripped of its earlier ease. He stopped a few feet away, hands clasped awkwardly in front of him. I wanted to say something before I left. The man began, his voice quieter now, less rehearsed. Earlier, I shouldn't have laughed. Apology was imperfect. It lacked eloquence. But it carried something else, discomfort and perhaps understanding. Sammy met the man's gaze, searching not for remorse, but for sincerity. Sammy asked calmly. The man swallowed. Because it was easier than thinking, he admitted. The honesty surprised them both. Sammy nodded once. Thinking usually is harder, he said, but it's also where things change. The man thanked him quietly and left without another word. Dean watched him go, then glanced back at Sammy. You didn't have to give him that moment, Dean said. Sammy shook his head. No, he replied, but I wanted to. When the last guest finally departed and the staff began clearing the room, the quiet that remained felt different from the silence earlier in the night. This silence wasn't tense. It wasn't heavy. It was settled, like a deep breath after a storm had passed. Sammy and Dean walked toward the exit together, unhurried. Neither speaking until they reached the doorway where the laughter had first greeted Sammy's arrival. Sammy paused there. Looking back one last time, I used to think moments like this were about survival, he said softly. About proving you deserve to stay in the room. Dean placed a hand briefly on the doorframe, thoughtful. They're not, he replied. They're about deciding whether the room deserves you. Outside, the air was cooler, cleaner, the noise of the city distant and indifferent. The world beyond the building had no idea what had unfolded inside, and it didn't need to. Some moments weren't meant for headlines. They were meant for memory, for quiet strength carried forward into places that still needed it, as they stepped into the night. Sammy felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not triumph, not validation, but peace. The kind that came from knowing he hadn't compromised himself, hadn't shrunk to fit someone else's comfort, hadn't mistaken silence for grace. Dean walked beside him, hands in his pockets, posture easy, as though the evening had simply confirmed what he had always known. The laughter that had once filled the room would be remembered, but not the way its owners intended. It would live on not as a moment of superiority, but as the instant it lost its power. And Dean's reaction, quiet, unwavering, unmistakable, would endure not because it was dramatic, but because it was right, long after the night faded into story. Long after names blurred and rooms changed, one truth would remain unchanged. Respect. Once claimed with dignity, could never be taken back.